And joining me now is Chuck Rosenberg, MSNBC legal analyst, former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official. So what should we make of these accusations from the whistleblower and the claims from his attorney?
Well, right now, Andrea, they're just accusations. Look, some whistleblowers are virtuous. Let's assume this gentleman is. And among virtuous whistleblowers, some are right and some are wrong. What this may devolve to, and I've seen this many, many times in my career as a federal prosecutor, is a disagreement over perhaps how the case ought to be charged or when it ought to be charged, what charges ought to be brought. So I wouldn't make too much of it at this point. Let's assume virtue, and let's find out whether or not this whistleblower is in fact correct or simply seeing things that aren't really there.
And how confident are you that the Justice Department and the Trump-appointed U.S. attorney, by the way, who's the Biden team has held over to handle this probe, are going to steer clear of politics as he does his work in Delaware?
So I'm biased, Andrea, and I come from the Department of Justice. I spent my professional career there, so I believe that it acts generally in the right way for the right reason. And remember, too, put aside the political appointees of the Department of Justice. There's a very, very thin political layer in the U.S. Attorney's Office and at the FBI, and for a good reason. So you have career people, career agents, career prosecutors making the most important decisions at the Department of Justice. Assuming that's the model and then it's in place, I have a lot of confidence in the Department of Justice.
What about the potential charges facing Hunter Biden? 3 tax crime charges and a related gun purchase charge. This is all, hypothetical at this point. We know he's repaid a tax liability that he had, but repaying it does not absolve the potential of some kind of criminal action.
That's exactly right. Nor does returning money to a bank that you've robbed. It doesn't absolve you of criminal liability. But that said, I started as a criminal tax prosecutor, and those are hard cases. And it turns on intent, proving that someone intentionally made a false statement on a tax return, hid income, evaded taxes, as opposed to a rounding error, something that would give rise to civil liability, but not criminal liability. And that might be where the problem lies here. Perhaps that the whistleblower is an IRS investigator who sees the case differently than prosecutors do. You know what, Andrea? It happens 100 times a day in U.S. attorneys' offices around the country. So again, I'm assuming good motive, but that doesn't mean the whistleblower is right. We need more facts to make that determination.
Chuck Rosenberg, thank you so much. We needed your expertise on this very controversial, obviously, controversial case in the highly political. Thank you.
D.C. police now hanging out the help wanted sign, but apparently there are very few takers. The size of that department shrinking to its lowest level in half a century. It happens as homicides and violent crime are on the rise in our nation's capital. Lucas Tomlinson on the streets of Washington for that and more. Lucas, good morning.
Good morning, Bill. Officials say fewer cops on the street has led to an increase in crime. That's the story here in the nation's capital and elsewhere. We spoke to the head of D.C.'s police union. He offered the following grim stats.
Beginning in 2020, we've lost almost 1,200 police officers, and 45% of those that have left have resigned, literally just turned in their badge and walked away. It's almost impossible to hire people. The police department has been hiring academy classes in the single digits, 7, 8, 9, sometimes 10 people.
You mentioned off the top, Bill, the D.C. police force now the smallest in 50 years. Officers leaving faster than they can be replaced. D.C.'s police chief says he could lose 200 more by the end of the year. While D.C.'s mayor says she wants more cops on the street, Chief Conte recently said that will be a big challenge. Let's take a look at those D.C. crime stats as of this morning. Homicides up 27%, sex abuse up 47%, motor vehicle theft has doubled. Total crime here in the nation's capital up 25%. Now, keep in mind, Bill, this rise in killings comes on top of last year's highs. Homicides in D.C. have been over 200 in each of the past 2 years, something this city has not seen in 20 years. We also spoke to neighboring Virginia's Attorney General about this crime spike.
You can't solve a problem unless you first acknowledge there is a problem. And our earnest hope is that Washington, D.C. gets away for some of this criminal first, victim last policies that have really led to a violent crime increase inside the district.
Now, earlier this week, the Republican-controlled House blocked a bill from the D.C. City Council, which the union said was soft on crime and anti-police. Expect crime to be a major issue in 2024. Bill.
Yeah, clearly. Thank you, Lucas. Nice to see you. Lucas Tomlinson in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
And let's bring in former chief of detectives for the NYPD and ABC News contributor Robert Boyce. Bob, the big question on everyone's minds is why do we see this so often now? What is behind this recent string of shootings here in the United States?
Mona, obviously, we're going into the warmer months right now, and you will see the biggest increase in shootings throughout the whole year is in May and June. But you see the hot-blooded nature of a lot of these things. They're in immediacy, and they're able to get a hold of a gun almost immediately as well. There's 400 million guns in this, in excess of 400 million guns in this country, and that's the big problem. People who are able to get them quickly, who shouldn't have them in their hands to begin with. And they're really looking at a dispute for the most part. But there's other things as well, social gatherings where something happens, someone pulls out a gun. These are tough times, and it's all about the amount and the easy accessibility to get that gun in their hands.
And some of those guns that you mentioned showing up at the airport as well. The number of guns found at airport checkpoints is up, with the TSA reporting that more than a 10% increase in recovered firearms for the first quarter of 2023 compared to the same time last year. The agency says 93% of the guns recovered were loaded. Why do you think more people are trying to travel with loaded firearms?
Well, a lot of these guns are legally possessed, and they just don't know how to do it. There's a process to moving your gun around the country if you wish to do that. If you're a security or a police, there's a process. We all know it. You have to notify the airline before you get there. They can either decline, you're not allowed, or let you do it in a safe manner. I think it's ignorance, a lot of this. A lot of these guns are not illegally possessed. It's too often. And they don't think they're going to get caught in the TSA by a TSA agent, which they're wrong. They will be. And that's the issue there, too. It's just they're moving more and more guns in the hands of people who don't know what to do, know how to move them about the country. And there's a feeling of they're afraid for their own safety. That's true too, but mostly there's a process here. They have to obey the process.
And Bob, as we try to figure out why we're seeing this more and more often, law enforcement has also said that a rise in privately manufactured ghost guns is a compounding problem. According to the California Attorney General's office, in 2015, state law enforcement agencies seized a total of 26 ghost guns. By 2021, that number had increased to more than 12,000. Do you think that stricter legislation at the federal level is necessary to deal with this?
I do, and it has to be done immediately because the ghost gun is the biggest threat to urban areas in the country. In New York City, there's a large spike in recoveries of these things. Now, you can just walk into any gun store and buy a frame for a weapon and then assemble it with parts from the internet. So we can't have that, and that's what's going on. And with no serial number, it's untraceable. This was purposely done. So it's the biggest problem we have. It should be a federal crime, and it hasn't been yet, from what I understand. And the trafficking in these things as well. In New York City, where it's no longer the iron pipeline where you get it from the south or states with lax gun laws, but people are buying these and putting them together in the city itself. And we're making arrests on those things with very little skill set necessary. You can buy these weapons, assemble them, and then get an extended magazine off the internet. The only hard part of it here is acquiring ammunition. That's the only difficult part. But it's more and more they're going against this.
All right, Bob Boyce, thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it.
Some intriguing new details now to add to the ongoing investigation into former President Donald Trump and 2020 election interference in the state of Georgia. For the first time, we're now seeing text messages between operatives working with Trump's legal team. In those texts, they're trying to figure out what to do with data from a breached voting machine and if they should or could use that information to try to decertify Georgia's Senate runoff back in 2021. There's a lot to sort out here. CNN's Zach Cohen and Sarah Murray join us with this new reporting. Zach, just walk us through what you've learned and where it fits.
Hey, John, these are two guys that we know were working directly with Trump's legal team, including people like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani, and they were really tasked with finding evidence of voter fraud, right, that could be used in lawsuits, that could be used to sort of discredit the presidential results. But we're learning for the first time now that after January 6th, after everything that happened that day, that hunt continued, and they did successfully get access to data from a voting machine in Coffee County. And these texts, 2 weeks after the breach happened, show you for the first time what they were planning to do with it. They were looking, it's very clear here. One text says, here's the plan. Let's keep this close hold for now. We only have until Saturday to decide if we're going to use this report to try to decertify the Senate runoff or if we hold it for a bigger moment later. Now, they're talking about the Senate runoff in Georgia, obviously the one that David Perdue, the Republican, lost, and it was won by Senator John Ossoff. But for the first time, we're getting a window into how people that were working for Trump in the lead up to in the aftermath of the 2020 election kept trying to do the same stuff weeks after.
So they keep going, even after January 6th. This is a conservative county, and this is part of a big, we always talk about the investigation by the DA in Fulton County is about the 2020 presidential race, but it's bigger than that.
It is bigger than that. I think what the DA is looking at there is really election interference, and this is part of it. You know, we know that she has information about not only the attempts to breach these voting machines in Coffee County, but also the attempts to try to use these to undermine or to try to undermine the Senate runoff results as well as the 2020 presidential election results. And it's telling that, you know, even after they saw how horribly it went trying to overturn the 2020 election, even after they saw what happened in January 6th, that there was still this kind of scheming going around in the layers around former President Trump at that time.
It's a very conservative county. So you would think if you're trying to prove fraud, why are you looking there? But is it because that's where they were able to get someone to help them get access? Is that this?
Exactly. They were able to find an election worker in Coffee County, which, as you mentioned, Trump won about 70% of the vote there. They were able to find an election worker who was sympathetic to some of the claims about, you know, voting machine irregularities, that, you know, they're potentially vulnerable to foreign hacking. And so they opened the front door and let this team of operatives in. You know, that data was shared with a select group of Trump allies, and ultimately they were talking about whether or not to use it to try to upend the Senate runoff results.
And important to note, data that no member of the public should be able to touch, especially nobody with access to it, no involved in a campaign with a partisan agenda should be able to touch.
Right.
Do we know where we're going here in terms of timetable?
Well, look, I mean, frankly, I think this is part of the reason the DA's investigation has taken so long, is that as we peel back the layers in a state like Georgia, we're finding more and more about what happened. I mean, we knew Donald Trump called Brad Raffensperger. We knew Rudy Giuliani showed up and said crazy things to state lawmakers. But it was well after that that we learned about this breach in Coffee County, that we learned about sort of the gang of people involved in that. And we know she's looking at these potential racketeering charges. Maybe this spring. We're still waiting.
All right. For this to be happening even after January 6th just speaks volumes. Thanks to both of you for coming in to share that great report.